passage and screening. I think you all could hear the recording, just so you know we are recording. So I'll start over. Welcome to this fish passage and screening rulemaking briefing. My name is Joy Jolson, and I'm a third-party neutral facilitator with Triangle Associates, and I'm here with my colleague Alex Sweetser, who's providing technical support and documentation. So as many of you may know, the purpose of this meeting is for DFW to inform you about the rulemaking being undertaken to implement RCW 77.57, known as Fishways Flow and Screening Statute, or the Fishways Flow and Screening Statute. So let me tell you a little more about this meeting. It'll consist of a presentation by WDFW staff. That'll take about 45 minutes, and then we're really going to move into a question answer period. And we have up to an hour. We really want to hear all your questions and get those answered. So it can go as late as 3:30. So we have a couple hours here. And so just walking through the agenda, and do we want to go ahead and pull up the first slide for the agenda here? So I'll just walk through verbally as we're pulling that up. There we go. So we're going to start with a welcome and overview with WDFW staff, and moving into the rulemaking process and authorities, actions outside of authority, a draft proposal, recommendations under the current authority. And we're going to have that question answer period with you and move on to next steps. So again, this meeting is recorded. I want to talk a little about how you're going to get your questions answered. And so during the presentation, you will have an opportunity to ask questions. And if you move your cursor down to the bottom of your screen, you're going to see a little icon that says Q&A. This can be a little confusing with the chat option. So if you can just direct your eyes down to the bottom, use your cursor, and there is that Q&A. And go ahead and ask questions at any point during the presentation or after the presentation. We'll get those in the queue. We'll go in the order of the questions offered. And so after the presentation, we'll move into answering your questions. And if for some reason we can't answer them, we may be able to follow up. Noting the public comment period is still ongoing until the public hearing, which will be this fall, and we'll talk a little more about that. So with that, I'd like to hand it off to Gabrielle, and she's going to do DFW introductions, and then Morgan's going to speak after Gabrielle. So go ahead and take it away.
Great. Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming today. I'm going to stop sharing the screen briefly so you can get familiar with our faces. My name is Gabrielle Stillwater, and I am the Fish Passage and Screening Rule Maker for the program. I've been managing this project for the last 3 years, and working on the draft and helping to bring our external partners together with DFW staff to put this proposal together for you. I'll pass it off to Morgan.
Hey, good afternoon, folks. I see some familiar names. I'm really glad to have folks here. I'm the Habitat Program Director for the Department of Fish and Wildlife, so I have the pleasure of supervising a number of different programs, including implementation of our 7757 authority and rules. Really glad to have you guys here. I think I'll pass it to Tom.
Thank you, Morgan. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tom Jameson. I'm the Fish Passage and Screening Division Manager within the Habitat Program. I also wear another hat. I'm the chair of the state's Fish Bearer Removal Board. And we'll be talking about some of the aspects of the division like inventory, like prioritization, along with this rulemaking effort. So at this point, I'd like to pass it to my fellow division manager, the Protection Division Manager, Matt Curtis.
Hey everybody, Matt Curtis, Protection Division Manager here in the Habitat Program, as Tom mentioned. Protection Division, if you're unfamiliar, and just real briefly, we are the division most responsible for implementation and interpretation of our hydraulic code authority. So that's 7755. But through that, we walk pretty closely with this 7757, not the same, but tied pretty tightly. And so here to talk about how both those things are clear questions that may walk that boundary between those two differing authorities as we go through this rulemaking process.
Great. Thanks so much for the introductions. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Morgan and resume the presentation.
All right, thank you, Gabriel. Well, in addition to welcoming you all, as I have, again, really appreciate your time. I wanted to provide a little bit of context for why we're here and why we initiated this rulemaking almost 3 years ago. Some of you may recall a while ago that Governor Inslee convened an orca task force to look at the plight of our southern resident orca. And out of that process came a number of recommendations, some of which were very much focused on increasing prey for orca and protecting the fish that we do have that feed those orca. One of the things that orca task force looked at was making sure that some of the really good laws that are on the books in Washington state were being fully implemented, and the public understands what those rules are or what those laws are and how to follow them. And to that end, one of the recommendations they made was that the Department of Fish and Wildlife should create a rule chapter for the law in RCW 7757. While the department has had a fairly successful program in place really for a number of decades, improving fish passage and addressing fish passage deficiencies, working on improving and maintaining screens to water diversions, the department had not ever created rules, even though that law had been on the books since the early part of the 20th century. And so subsequent to that recommendation coming from the Orca Task Force, the governor's office agreed, and subsequent to that, the legislature agreed. And so the department received some direction from the legislature about 3 years ago, asking us to go ahead and undertake the rulemaking process. Initially, when we started that process, I think somewhat naively, we thought it would be fairly straightforward because the department has for many years been able to implement and achieve some of our fish passage and screening goals through our HPA authority, our hydraulic project approval authority. Our initial strategy in creating this rulemaking was that we would largely cut and paste rules for our 7755 authority here into this chapter. And our thinking was that that would be less confusing for folks and would show consistency and sort of parity between the rules for both authorities. One of the things that we found in the early part of the rulemaking when we were doing that exploration and having initial tribal webinars and webinars for the public and partners was that was in fact really confusing to folks and didn't achieve our goal of having people understand what is either the same or different about the two authorities. So we'll talk more later in the presentation about how we've tried to be more clear in this rule proposal about areas of consistency and areas where the authorities are slightly different and work in conjunction with each other to achieve the outcomes that we want around fish passage and screening. It's still true, though, that most of this rulemaking is about codifying our existing practices and approaches and goals around fish passage and screening. The one exception to that is that we are including some language to bring in consideration of climate adaptation into the rules that govern fish passage structures and water crossings. We have been implementing considerations of climate change on a voluntary basis for a number of years now. And in, I believe it was 2019 or 2018, the director and the department committed to our tribal partners that we would consider in this rulemaking whether and how to incorporate considerations of climate change into this regulatory structure. So that's the one piece that is new and not just about implementing our existing regulatory approaches. So I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to Gabriel, and while she's spinning up and transitioning the slides, I will say again, I mentioned we've been working on this for quite some time, and I'm grateful for many of you sticking with us, hanging in there, and tracking us through the whole process, which Gabriel's going to talk about.
Great. Thanks so much, Morgan, for teeing us up. The slide before you just demonstrates where we've gone in our process through this rulemaking process. For those of you who are new to rulemaking or haven't, spent a lot of time with this, there are three main steps that come with the developing a rule. That's filing and publishing the CR 101, which is basically the pre-proposal inquiry, letting everybody broadly know we're considering creating rules and taking that under. And we had that published in the State Register back in July 1st of 2020. So it's been over 3 years now, which just points to the importance and the finagling of getting all of these things right. And throughout that time, between now and when we filed the CR 102, which says, hey, we've got a draft and this is what you can expect to see, we've done a lot of different series of outreach. The initial one happening, letting people broadly know what we as a department do already, as well as different iterations that you've seen of the rule where we've taken that feedback and have come up with the draft that you see before you today. And kind of next steps with that, it's going to happen after we have a chance to present the proposed rule to the Fish and Wildlife Commission. There's been a shift in schedule, so we're going to be having that either at the October 26th meeting or on November 17th. We're just kind of shifting through the scheduling changes on those, and we'll have a news release available to you, as well as follow up by email for everybody who's participated and responded in the comments to let them know when exactly they can expect for us to engage with the Fish and Wildlife Commission. And then we end with the CR 103, which is a filing with the Code Revisor's Office, letting them know that we've adopted the rule. It has the final version of the rule language as well, and that gets published into a WAC. And so we hope to have that by the end of this year, or if not, by the very early start of next year as well. And letting you know what we're doing to create this new Washington Administrative Code is these are the authorities that we are referring to as we've developed this new WAC for the agency. RCW 7757 is small, but it is mighty. And so before you on the screen are a few of just the statutes that we thought would be appropriate for this rulemaking. Two that are notably missing is 080, which deals with specifically the Toutle River and the management of the Toutle River. So it didn't make a lot of sense to have here. And 020 basically deals with DFW's responsibilities when it comes to the Department of Ecology issuing water rights. And so not exactly the best fit for this rulemaking, but the five RCWs you see on your screen here are the basis for the WAC that we've devised and are going to be sharing before you. We also think it's really important that before we get into what you can expect to see within this rulemaking, we really want to fully acknowledge what you aren't going to see as part of this rulemaking. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Tom Jameson, and he'll talk to you a little bit about what you won't be able to see in this draft proposal.
All right. Thank you, Gabrielle. So over the last 30 years, the agency has been intensively engaged in inventorying and assessing structures that have been built in Washington State streams and rivers. Those structures include culverts that in most cases turn into fish passage barriers. We've also inventoried small dams, diversions, water intakes. The results of those inventories are maintained in what we call the Fish Passage Diversion and Screening Database. That's a public-facing website that any of you on this call can freely access. In that database, we've inventoried and assessed about 50,000 items or 50,000 structures. Of those structures, the inventory for fish passage barriers is really intensively focused in Western Washington, and that's been related to inventories conducted before and during the imposition of the federal culvert case injunction against the state. So the inventory for fish passage barriers, pretty complete, but pretty focused on the western side of Washington State. As far as water intakes and unscreened diversions, that inventory has been focused in the opposite part of the state, on the east side of the state, where intensive irrigation has occurred to benefit agriculture since the state was settled. So from that database, for fish passage barriers, we believe that there's somewhere in the area of 18 to 20,000 barriers to salmon and steelhead in the state of Washington. As far as unscreened diversions in Western Washington, there's still a tremendous amount of inventory and assessment that needs to be done. But we expect that that number is also relatively large. In our work with the Department of Ecology, we believe that there's about 3,000 unscreened intakes or water diversions just in the Skagit watershed alone. So both relatively big problems. As the slide talks about, the true rulemaking effort does not address, it doesn't offer a prioritization scheme that when you have so many either unscreened diversions or barriers on the landscape, it doesn't offer a scheme to how those should be corrected. It also does not offer a funding mechanism, not part of the rulemaking process. But we've been working, despite not being part of the rulemaking process, we've been working in both of those areas. The legislature also tasked Fish and Wildlife shortly after tasking us with this rulemaking effort with developing a statewide fish passage barrier removal prioritization scheme. To that end, we have hired Kramer Fish Sciences and Triangle Associates, and they have formed an independent science panel to develop a set of recommendations that will be returned to the agency that will help the agency develop a scheme or a series of recommendations for fish passage barrier corrections. As far as funding goes, we've been working in that area also. So the rulemaking effort does include 2 independent studies that we contracted out. The Small Business Economic Impact Statement, the SBEIS, and then a cost-benefit analysis, and those are available for your review. As far as funding fish passage barriers go, we know that correcting and basically installing new stream crossings is a relatively expensive proposition. And we know that through our work with the Fish Barrier Removal Board that we chair, which is a grant program, and other grant programs that we're associated with, like the Family Forest Fish Passage Program, the Salmon Recovery Funding Board, and then city and county programs that we're associated with. So we know that the cost of correcting these barriers on the landscape and correcting diversions that are unscreened is relatively expensive. What we're working on, what we've seen the legislature generously fund is these grant programs to offer really no-cost grants to barrier owners for the correction of their fish passage barriers. For diversions, unscreened diversions and unscreened intakes, to date, most of those have been paid through mitigation funds that have been provided by the major dams on the Columbia River. So Bonneville Power Association, Chelan PUD, Priest Rapids Coordinating Council, they have funded most of the installation of screen systems on particularly municipal water intakes and irrigation systems. Correcting the majority of unscreened intakes in the state isn't as an expensive proposition as fish passage barriers. Many of these intakes are relatively small. Typically hoses of different dimensions that have been put into waterways to irrigate small plots. So those fixes would not be expensive, but we anticipate that state grant programs will, at least initially, help to mitigate the cost of screening diversions and correcting fish passage barriers. So at this point, I'll turn it back over to Gabrielle.
Great. Thank you so much, Tom, for going over that. Now, before we dive into the proposal and what you can expect to see as you read the draft rule language, which should be available on DFW's website, I just want to do a quick reminder that if you guys have questions as the presentation is happening, you don't have to wait until the end. There should be a Q&A tab at the bottom of your chat function, and please go ahead and ask your questions there so you can remember them at the end of the presentation when we're ready to address the questions that you might have. So now we'll talk about the proposal and what you can expect to see there. As we've designed this and created this new WAC chapter, we wanted to make sure we were following the outline that many of the DFW WACs already have for themselves. So of course, we start with an introduction and instructions on how to use the WAC and the intentions of that. The introduction does give a nod to the Orca Task Force with the recovery of salmon and the importance of that. However, we do know that these rules are intended to protect all fish species at all life stages. And that's important to us because we recognize that Washington has more than just salmon. There are lamprey and other important species that will eventually need to be protected and appropriately passed as the science becomes available. And then we note that these rules are supposed to be used in tandem with the hydraulic code, which many of the folks that we regulate are familiar with. So we're using a lot of the good concepts we have there where appropriate, and that for new structures, that makes sense to use that as well. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about the definitions and then go through the rest of this through the presentation. Within the definitions, you'll see a couple of new terminologies, new terms that are new to us as a result of this rulemaking. The first being climate adapted water crossings. We want to make sure we're being explicitly clear about what that means and where we expect that to apply to. And also adding in a definition for entrainment. Which is new, and it relates to water diversions and the importance of protecting fish species as well. And then finally, there is going to be a new definition for fishways. And we're going to specifically call that out as a discussion point here. When you're reading the RCW and also when you're reading this new WAC chapter, when we're speaking towards fishways, it's important to remember that we're using this as an umbrella term. That means it's including both water crossing structures such as bridges and culverts, as well as fish passage improvement structures such as fish ladders and weirs. I know many of you, when you hear the term fishways, you automatically think about fish ladders, but that's not the case here. And I'm going to turn it over to Morgan Carlson to just explain a little bit about why we're using this umbrella terminology.
Thanks, Gabriel. Yeah, I'm happy to speak about this a little bit. And just to add to what Gabriel's saying for context that some of you might not be aware of, as she said, in the more recent past, the term fishways has come to be sort of synonymous with fish ladders. When we started this rulemaking, it was very important to us to make sure that we were going back with fresh eyes and doing a very close read of the actual statute itself and what we can understand of the legislative intent. And when we went and did that, one of the things that became very clear is that the section of the RCW that speaks to fish passage speaks in very sort of plain talk terms that the legislative intent was for the ways that fish want to pass through rivers and streams, that any human-made obstruction on, over, under, through those rivers and streams should provide durable and effective ways for fish to pass over, under, through those structures. And so again, a read of the legislative intent is that when it was constructed at the time in the early 20th century, they meant the term fishways to be more plain talked and inclusive as the ways fish pass. And it turns out when we dug back in a little bit further and looked for supporting materials inside our own records, that actually that is the way the term fishways was used further back in various memos and materials that we even have here at the department. And so I was joking that this is a little bit like fashion. You know, it seems like everything comes back around on a 30-year cycle. Appears that's the case for the term fishways as well. And again, I'm happy to, you know, have additional discussion about that when we get to the Q&A. So please let us know if you'd like to talk about that further.
Great. Thanks so much, Morgan, for stepping in there. And then finally, we get into the applicability section of the rule, which is important. It's good for us to know where these rules will and will not apply. And so we wanted to make sure we were being clear about performance standards and having them apply to protecting all fish species at all life stages for both water diversions and for fishway structures. And also when it comes to projects, that it's going to apply to both new and existing structures on a lake, stream, or river. This is definitely where we see the diversion from the hydraulic code, because the hydraulic code, generally speaking, is about creating permits for new projects on the landscape or for work that is proactively being done. Whereas this particular WAC that we're working on and we're presenting to you today really speaks to the fact that we're able to go to any structure on the landscape, regardless of its hydraulic code status, to look towards creating fixes for anything that might be a barrier. Now, of course, we come to exemptions because it's important to know where this doesn't apply. Now, these aren't things that the agency came up with on our own. These are, in fact, very explicitly stated within RCW 7757 themselves. And the first one being is that any structure that's part of a man-made agricultural drainage facility, such as a tide gate or a floodgate, is exempt from this process as long as it was installed before May 20th, 2003. And so any future repair or replacement of those same structures on that system are also exempt from this as long as they were built and in place legally before May 20th, 2003. And then next, there's this exemption for water diversion specifically. And it's essentially that anything that was installed legally before June 11th, 1947 is exempt from this, but only if they're on a system where exclusively game fish are present. And this has to do a lot with when the department used to be the Department of Game and the Department of Fish, and we combined together to create the Department of Fish and Wildlife. There were some similar statutes in different areas that govern that. And when the DFW that you know and love today was formed, they came together, and there was some strange overlap between them, and I'll let Morgan dive a little bit more into this aspect specifically.
Yeah, and really just building off what Gabriel said, some of you may be aware that we used to have a separate Department of Fisheries and a separate Department of Wildlife. And when those two departments were merged in the early 90s, the legislature did a lot of work, and I'm sure the Code Revisor's Office as well, trying to merge the two statutes that govern the separate agencies. And occasionally we still find to this day places where there are remnants of the separate authorities that still exist in the department's RCW today. This is one of those places, and when we dug back in and dissect and looked at what was going on, it became clear that this particular chapter has one section that speaks about fish passage more from the Department of Fish from the old Department of Wildlife's authority, and they retained the somewhat analogous authority that came from the Department of Fisheries. And so when we try to figure out what that means, what we understand is that this particular exemption that Gabriel went through came from the old Department of Wildlife statutes, and what that department's statutes governed was really game fish. And so what we are relaying here under 3A and B is our understanding that that particular exemption should only apply in places where clearly only the old Department of Wildlife's authority would apply. And that's what you see in front of you. Again, this is another one. Happy to answer more questions or have a little bit more dialogue about that during the Q&A if needed.
Right. And so finally, now we start getting into the meat and potatoes of this rule language. So you guys know where it will, it won't apply, what our intentions are behind this. And so first and foremost, when you go back and read RCW 7757, it heavily refers to and talks about compliance. And one thing we realized as we were developing these rules, that when we're talking about compliance and doing that, it's important to have standards that are clear and concise so people know whether or not they are in compliance or not. So this is where we as an agency look to the processes that we've been doing for a long time and how they apply and making sure that we codify those. So for this first part here, I'm going to break down fishways into the two different parts that they have with water crossing structures and fish passage improvement structures. And then I'm going to talk a little bit more about the standards that we've selected for water diversions. So for water crossing structures, you'll first start to notice that this is where you'll see the incorporation of this climate adaptive water crossings introduced and the importance of climate change and adding that into design because most structures when they're built are designed to last between 50 and 100 years. And so to maximize people's investment in the construction that they do, we want to make sure that we're thinking about the future and where it relates specifically to where the structure falls on the landscape. And then it moves along to talk about the standards, generally speaking, where we talk a little bit about behavioral impediments such as long, dark channels or really strong odors that might accumulate within the system, and things you're familiar with, such as excessive water drop, referencing velocity, surface flow, bed material, and other related conditions that you all have known and worked with for a long time. And then we talk about the importance for any new projects that you need to consider the future 100-year peak flow and also the future bank full width as part of these projections. We are utilizing the department's Culverts and Climate Change app, which we feel very confident in. We've had it for a number of years and have developed it in tandem with the University of Washington as well. And so if the aggregate you get between the 10 models from our Culverts and Climate Change app is less than 5%, you don't need to consider any further as part of your design and your new structure for that. But if it's greater than 5%, it opens up a dialogue for you to have with our permitting biologists about what the structure should look like, knowing what some of those projections may be. Next, as part of the standard section in this is we reference our use of the water crossing design guidelines, which have long guided the principles for what is fish appropriate. And so it's something we've used for a long time and we feel good about doing that as well. And we look forward to updating those throughout the years as we move forward with this. And then finally, when it comes to understanding whether or not something is able to pass fish, is we reference the fish passage and inventory and assessment guidance that the agency has created and used for many years as an initial point of determining passability for fish. So generally speaking, those are the standards that we set. And knowing that we have climate adapted language in this, and based on a lot of the feedback we heard over the course of this development, is we've created this exemption clause, and we've realized that there are some concerns. So we want to be explicit in this, that as long as your water crossing, so your bridge or your culvert, is passing fish and was legally installed and it's functioning the way we originally intended to, you don't have to prematurely upgrade it for climate change. But once it does start to become a barrier to fish that we expect to see in that system, then we would expect people to change, build, or move that into more of a climate friendly system to handle future flows and bank full width changes that we would see. And finally, we'll jump over to talk about the fish passage improvement structures and the standards that we have for these specifically. Amongst our fish life concern section, we do note that this is generally not our preferred structure to move and pass fish because in and of itself, it can be a barrier either to a specific age of a fish and life stage of a fish or to a specific species of fish as well. And it does require quite a bit of maintenance as well. And generally, we try to only permit these when an artificial barrier cannot be removed from the landscape, because we want to make sure we're passing some fish, even if it can't be all the fish that exist within that system. And so generally speaking, the standards that you guys have worked with are very much the same when it comes to sediment accumulation, flow, and surface drop, making sure that you're maintaining adequate flow for the fish species. And this is an important one to note as well, is that we cannot use fish passage improvement structures to get around natural barriers on the landscape unless there are some very rare and extraordinary circumstances where it makes sense to restore native fish species. And I'll let Morgan jump in here and add a little bit more context.
Yeah, building on again what Gabriel said, it is not the current policy of the department to typically provide passage around natural barriers. And that's largely coming from the standpoint that the approach that we try to use currently is about restoring native ecosystems and their resilience and the processes associated with them. And so providing sort of human provided passage around a natural barrier isn't typically a part of that. However, it is something that we, the state, have done in the past, sometimes in collaboration with our tribal fishery co-managers. And those have largely been in circumstances where it's in the context of recovery or boosting flagging fish populations. And so we wanted to include rulemaking language that makes it clear that's not the preference and not a go-to approach, but also leaving room that there may be in the future rare circumstances that would indicate that kind of approach. I think part of that rare circumstances would be that it's likely a decision that we would make in conjunction with tribal co-managers and not something to be taken lightly. And again, I think that would make it a relatively rare occurrence, especially for a new passage situation around a natural barrier.
Great. Thank you again. And so finally, we'll move along to talk about the standards for the water diversions. Like the previous sections that you saw, we talk about fish life concerns and how having inappropriate water designs can harm and even kill fish if they're not appropriately screening throughout the system. And then we talk generally about what standards are needed to make sure we're protecting fish life and ensure that we're providing adequate screening and effective screening, which of course means there's no apparent damage or accumulation of debris. And then as you're reading through, it'll start to feel very familiar to all of you if you're familiar with our hydraulic code. And that's because we wanted to maintain a lot of parity between the hydraulic code and this water diversion standard because we realized as we were reading through this RCW 7757 and looking at the hydraulic codes authority 7755 that there were a lot of similarities between theirs, but the differences is what we really concentrated on, and that tends to come across particularly when it comes to whose authority has responsibility in water diversion scenarios. So in most instances, actually in all instances of fish passage, we wouldn't not use the principles that we see in the hydraulic code authority, but there are aspects from 7755 that aren't covered under that. And so to be a little bit more clear, we've created this graphic for you to understand. So the items in red, both the head structure and the fish bypass outlet, we realize those themselves are actually governed by the hydraulic code, by RCW 7755. But what happens in the ways behind the head structure with the fish screen and the fish bypass to get to the outlet is that there's this breakdown in authority, where that's where 7757 steps in and covers the protection of fish with that. As many of you know, when it comes to water diversions, not every scenario or situation is the same. So oftentimes there'll be a bit of a distance between where the water is diverted at the head structure before the fish get to the fish screen. And so it's that area kind of behind there that fish are left to be potentially unprotected. And so you'll see that we've had some pretty firm construction and design standards that aren't just generalized, they're very specific to what you'll see on the landscape.
And I'd just like to add a little bit. We've always known about the differences between 7755 and 7757, and this rulemaking, creating rules specifically for 7757, challenged us with how to be as clear as possible about where each apply. So to provide a little bit of the explanation for the differences that Gabriel spoke to and that are depicted on the screen, our hydraulic authority under 7755 is it expressly under RCW does not apply in wholly artificial waterways. So what that means is if there is a waterway that's entirely man-made, like an agricultural water distribution system, an irrigation system, or a flume, a man-made flume leading to a hydro generation facility, our HPA authority doesn't apply. Our HPA authority does apply in all natural waters, even what we call altered natural waters. So if there was a stream there historically and maybe it got straightened or diked or other ways altered by people, our HPA authority still applies. It's really those situations where the conveyance of water is totally artificial, where our HPA authority doesn't apply. And so that's why, as you can see on this diagram, when we're talking about irrigation structures in particular, or as I said, other diversions like to a hydro facility, our HPA authority applies at the point where we're still doing work in or near natural waters, like that fish bypass outlet and that head structure. But everything behind that is wholly artificial. And thus we need to be able to provide the same level of design guidance and construction guidance for those fish screens in those wholly artificial waters. Normally that level of detail would be taken care of in our hydraulic code. And so again, at the end of the day, practically speaking, what that means is that we needed to make sure that the rules for this screening, fish passage and screening chapter carried the level of detail necessary to stand on its own in terms of directing people how to undertake those projects in a way that meets the department's approval. That means you'll see a level of detail in the fish screening section of the rules that you do not see in the fish passage section of the rules. Again, happy to take more questions and talk about that a little more if you have practical scenarios that you want to talk about in the Q&A.
And now that you all understand the general standards for both protection and passability, now we'll dive into the compliance efforts for this. I will say that when we started looking at what we wanted this compliance section to look like, we definitely looked to the model that DFW has been doing for years, both in the hydraulic section and then also in our new compliance division as well, and making sure that we're bringing a lot of the good concepts that we've been working on for years over to this. And so, of course, we start with voluntary assistance and making sure that we're putting people and the relationships we've built with them first. So allowing people to achieve voluntary compliance, whether that's getting an HPA permit or entering into agreement. Many times people may not even be aware that they in fact have a barrier, an improperly designed fish screen. So we really want to lead with having education first and putting that relationship there first. And then from that voluntary assistance, if someone reaches out to us, we can provide some more technical assistance where maybe we're being a little bit more proactive, providing some more voluntary support, again, with information, going out and doing even a site visit for an assessment, and helping people with that aspect of it, to help them really understand the purpose of this and what they need to do to comply. There are a couple of caveats to this, though, is that if there is more than minor harm for fish, or if the owner of the structure has had a previous violation of 7755 or 57, then we might be able to move to kind of some of the next steps, such as a correction request or notice to comply. As part of the technical assistance support visit, we just want to make sure, again, we're adequately protecting and passing fish, but being aware that sometimes some egregious circumstances may lead us to start taking a little bit more progressive action. Following on the technical assistance visit, occasionally our compliance inspections can occur. So our compliance inspectors for the agency will come out to do an assessment and again provide some of that technical assistance as they can. But during that compliance inspection, they might also again issue that correction request or notice to comply, depending on the level of fish. And although earlier we mentioned that prioritization isn't necessarily a part of these rules, we do give a nod to the importance of that in this compliance inspection section, and that we will prioritize the compliance inspections based on the quality and quantity of the fish habitat that is both upstream and downstream of the possible violation, as well as the fish resources that are in the system and the fish species that we expect to see there as well. So we want to make sure we're being judicious and kind of putting some sideboards around this. And this did come about as, people who are very excited to possibly get their neighbors into trouble when it comes to us implementing this new rule. So we want to make sure we're using our time and our energies responsibly and putting it where it matters the most, and protecting fish where it makes the most sense. And then eventually we talk a little bit more about some of the compliance pathways that you can achieve. Our correction request, of course, isn't an official notice. It's getting a little bit more stringent, saying, we know you have this violation. Here's a plan that we can have to execute to make this safe and protect fish. And if the notice to or if our correction request isn't met with a positive response, then we can move to our official notice to comply, which is really kind of our official administrative notice that we give to people, saying we've exhausted all of the other options that we can to get to here. It is very important that you correct this barrier, that you make sure you are appropriately screening your water diversion. And so this is kind of like a hard stop for us. And so after we issue that notice to comply, there are additional remedies that we can follow up with, such as like criminal or enforcement actions, whether that's having our DFW enforcement officers issue citations, whether that's pursuing a public nuisance, and exploring several options there, all the way up to kind of the full authority of the RCW itself, which in some instances is coming onto an individual's property, turning off the water and keeping the water off until the appropriate repair is made, or coming onto an owner's property and correcting the barrier itself, and in some instances placing a lien onto the owner to recoup the cost of this. I will say that is not going to be the first action we ever take, and I'll let Morgan step in and talk a little bit more about the compliance pathways.
I think Gabriel did a great job speaking to it. I will just add that it is the department's commitment, largely honed through our execution of our HPA authority, that we want to make sure that we are starting from a place, as Gabriel described, of helping people comply with the law. That's something that is codified in our HPA statute, and it's been very important to us. We believe that that's a good government approach to regulation, reserving the more serious responses to times when somebody declines to voluntarily comply, or the harm is so great and ongoing that we need to escalate the response right away. This the RCW 7757, as we've mentioned, it was written in the early part of the 20th century, and those very serious responses that Gabriel quickly summarized that give the department the authority to go on to private property and either close and keep a diversion closed, or fix a barrier and place a lien against the property, are very serious. Those are serious responses. The department has never utilized those authorities. And I hope it's clear why. Those are, again, very serious responses. And I think in addition to being potentially inconsistent, or it would be a rare circumstance where we believe that would be consistent with how we want to run our regulatory program. Those, I think, would be challenging situations for Washington's governance in general, executive branch and legislative branch. And so as we were writing this rule language, we wanted to make it very clear those are authorities that exist, but make it equally clear how that those would be authorities to be used in egregious circumstances. So again, we're trying to be transparent about the authorities and equally transparent about our philosophy and how we would approach risk and the matchup of the tool to the level of risk presented. So again, as you've heard me say a few times, happy to talk a little bit more about that in the Q&A if you wish.
Right. So it's equally important for us to lay out what the compliance mechanisms are to ways in which people can appeal this official administrative action. So if we're going to do something, we want to make sure we give folks an opportunity to respond to us and what the agency has decided to do. And so within this rule chapter, we lay out the process for both an informal and a formal response. And again, that's putting people first and foremost at the front of this. Both the informal and appeals section note that individuals are welcome to come and try and work out the disagreements that they may have with the decisions that we've made with the notice to comply first without even starting this process. But again, within 30 days of receiving the notice to comply, they can initiate the informal or the formal appeals process. And we want to make sure we're able to find resolution that works for those. A big reason why we chose to incorporate the informal appeals process as well is we want to make sure that we're giving everyone an opportunity to respond regardless of their ability to hire legal help. Whereas the formal appeals process requires attorneys and is a little bit more serious, but we want to make sure we're not adding an additional barrier to folks that may disagree with the decisions we make as an agency. All right, so that was it for the entire proposal that you saw. It's a lot in a very little thing. So now is a good point that if we have any questions, we'll check the Q&A and initiate that discussion.
Great, thank you. Okay, so now we're beginning our question answer period. And we have a great table that we're using to live edit your questions and any responses from DFW staff. Now, I'm only seeing one question, which is actually in the chat. So we're going to start with that. A reminder to everyone about asking questions. So if you take your cursor, you can move it down your screen, and that's when your Q&A option does pull up. And go ahead and ask questions in the Q&A. We have plenty of time for questions, so we'd love to hear from you. And we'll go ahead and get started here with the first question. And I'll read it. Let's see. How does this new umbrella term for fishways jive with the language of the culvert injunction that specifically targets culverts and does not include fishways? Now that all the culverts are considered fishways by the state, doesn't that confuse things? And so we'll have a DFW staff answer that. And Alex, do you mind just making it a little bit bigger? All right, go ahead.
Yeah, I can take a start at this, and then Tom Jameson might want to jump in before we check with Heather if we've answered the question. Well, the first thing I would say, Heather, is I think that's a good question. I've been running regulatory programs for a long time now, and I think one of the things that's wonderful about Washington State is we have a number of different authorities and some really great case law. And one of the drawbacks is that it makes for a complicated kind of regulatory setting. So I think the super short answer is I often see confusion about how all of those things play together. That said, I think it's really important to note, especially for other folks who might not be as familiar with the culvert injunction, that the culvert injunction is a very separate authority, if you will, with a very separate scope than any of the state authorities. And that includes, I would say, both our HPA authority as well as the 7757 authority. Again, for folks who might not be familiar, the culvert case injunction applies only to the case area in Western Washington, and it applies only to state owned, I'm not going to get the words exactly right, but it's essentially culverts under state owned roads. So the geographic scope is smaller, the substantive scope of what sort of types of projects and situations it covers is smaller than our other state authorities. And the remedies agreed to, directed or agreed to under the auspices of the culvert injunction stand alone and sort of are the highest governance of a particular site or situation. And at the same time, we've already found with our HPA authority, even before undertaking this rulemaking, that we have to be mindful of continuing to take responsibility for interpreting and executing the authority that the legislature gives us that is often different in scope or coverage. For this fish passage and screening rulemaking, I think the important differences from what I just described about the scope and coverage of the injunction are that it's statewide. It covers any river or stream where fish passage would be needed or expected, or there is a risk presented from having a water diversion that might not be screened. And there are such many situations as a result where our state RCWs apply that don't have an intersection with the injunction. And we need to make sure, regardless of any federal or state court cases, that we're following through in the direction the legislature is giving us and doing our best to be transparent about how we understand and interpret that. The heart of Heather's question, though, is, might that cause confusion? And I think, again, the long and the short is, as I said earlier, it might. What we've already found in the context of our HPA decisions is that, especially within the area and the types of projects covered by the injunction, we often have to continue to work and engage in extra dialogue with folks wherever needed about the similarities and the differences. And if we find ourselves as an agency in a situation where we have to make a decision related to our state authority, we work really hard to be transparent and clear about that we're making that decision or recommendation under our state authority, and acknowledging and noting that that's different than the federal case injunction, and that people we're talking to may still have to follow, of course, the federal injunction. Did I miss anything, Tom?
Gosh, Margaret, I don't think so. That was a pretty pretty detailed answer on that. I mean, the only things I would emphasize is that, an injunction by its nature, a federal injunction, it's an order from a federal judge. So it trumps anything that the state's doing. And as Morgan mentioned, the injunction, it's very specific. It's one type of fish passage barrier, just one type, culverts. It's under one ownership, just one ownership, state owned. It's in a defined area. You mentioned that. It's in a specific area of the state. The case area defined by treaties signed by Governor Stevens in 1854 and 1855 with 21 of Washington's tribal nations. It only offers 3 types of correction: abandonment, stream simulation culvert, or a full span bridge. And it's not only time bound. Justice Martinez gave the state a certain time to reach a certain level of compliance, but it also carries on in perpetuity. So those state-owned culverts within the case area, they have to remain passable to salmon and steelhead. And again, it's only for salmon and steelhead. It's not for all fish. But they have to remain passable in perpetuity, which is a long time. Forever is a long time. So yeah, the injunction is very specific, and it's a federal order. It also comes with the injunction also comes with 35 pages of its own definitions of how the judge defined water crossings, the species affected, what a culvert is. So yeah, so it was very, very specific. I can understand the confusion.
Okay. Thank you, and nice job, Alex, live editing that. So we have another couple questions here. Again, for folks that want to ask questions, you just move your cursor down to the bottom of your screen and you'll see a Q&A there. And so we'd love to hear any questions you may have. So we'll move on to the next question. AWC has concerns about the compliance aspect given the number of city-owned culverts that may be impeding fish passage. While there's a desire to make corrections, there's not sufficient state or local funding available. How do you intend to address the significant lack of available public funding when it comes to enforcing compliance provisions?
Took me a second to get off mute. Tom, were you jumping in? You want to go first, or would you like me to?
Well, I mean, just for since this is a public meeting, there's probably people not aware what AWC stands for. That's Association of Washington Cities, for members of the audience that might not be aware of that. Funding is certainly an issue when it comes to not only fish passage, but to screening water diversions. Talked a little bit about that in my piece. We know that particularly with fish passage crossings that they're high cost, and that's related to the cost of road construction. That's vastly increased really since the pandemic began. What I didn't go into great detail is that the legislature has been very generous in funding grant programs like the Fish Barrier Removal Board, Family Forest Fish Passage Program, Surf Board, and then with bipartisan infrastructure law, with the passage of that law, there's a tremendous amount of federal money. But what we have discussed, and Association of Washington Cities is one of the Fish Barrier Removal Board charter members. But what we discussed in those meetings is how do we get those federal funds? Because there are some regulations and rules that you have to follow to handle the federal funds. As I said earlier, with these rules, we're also developing a prioritization scheme. And when it comes to compliance, we don't anticipate running around the entire state and pointing out, we know there's at least 13,000 fish passage barriers, and we know that they all don't carry the same importance to the fish. Compliance is going to be very selective. It's always going to start with an offer of technical assistance, and then it's going to be followed if that landowner or barrier owner is willing, or that water diversion owner is willing, with access to a grant. Now, is there enough grant money right now to fix them all? Right at this time, no. But I think that any type of compliance action is going to be, it's going to be very few, and it's going to be just the most important. And in my belief, there will be grant money enough to cover landowners that are willing, when it's pointed out that they have a very important fish passage barrier on their property, or they have a very egregious unscreened diversion. I think most will be willing to accept, a no-costs grant for them. Something that is in the very early, very early stages of consideration, is a low or no cost loan program managed by the state, very similar to what the state offers for failing septic systems that landowners could take advantage of to help fund these. But I think in the short term, I think that it's access to grants. And again, as we've seen, the legislature has been very generous, particularly in this last biennium, funding fish passage. Morgan, do you want to add some here from your perspective?
Yeah, I think Tom spoke really well to the funding and providing funding aspects of Candace's question. The other piece, Candace, that I see in her question is really maybe underlying a question about the compliance approach that the department intends to take. And so I just want to go back to something Gabriel covered in the presentation, which is that we included language in the rules that starts to signal about circumstances that we see as being high risk, that are causing high, more than minor harm or ongoing harm, and that indicating that we can take an elevated compliance response in those situations. And that's both, I think, good government and policy, but it was also something we wanted to include thinking ahead to the fact, as Tom's describing and your Candace is asking about, there's quite a high number of fish passage barriers and quite a number of places where we think there's need for putting screens on diversions. And so we know automatically that we will need to prioritize our own efforts to assist with compliance with this statute, even more so than we do now. And so our intent moving forward is much the same as it is today, to make sure that we are thinking about the places where providing a correction to fish passage barrier or screen is going to have the greatest benefit possible in the nearest term to fish, and really focusing our time and attention in those places. And I think that for cities, and I would say counties, but in particular cities, have been really active partners in this work. And I think we are largely both looking at high priority fish passage opportunities and also working hard to make sure that when there's a normal maintenance or a replacement, I guess I would say, in the course of cities and counties' efforts to maintain their transportation infrastructure, that we're hitting that bar of durable fish passage in replacing those projects. And I would expect that to continue. So I would see the largest impact of this rulemaking or sort of change for this rulemaking to be in those situations where the person who owns a barrier is refusing to work with the state to come up with a plan for correction. And by and large, I don't think that's most of the cities that we work with.
Thank you, Morgan. All right. Next question. And Alex is just visually above the question that we can see here. There you go. Can you describe the history, and I'll let you read that number, regarding the 1963 date referenced, and what role you see for the DFW in carrying out this rule?
So I'll go ahead and take a first crack at this because this is about specifically the proposed rule specific to the new section that we have in there, and it relates to the applicability. There's a third item because we have subsection 1, subsection 2, and this is in subsection 3 where we note the 1963 date that's being asked in this question. The history and the provenance of this, it was originally in the hydraulic code, and then back in 2005, both the RCW 77 55040 and 55060 were recodified as RCW 7757 010 and 030 pursuant to this change in 2005 with the legislature, and that would be under second substitute House Bill 1346, specifically the subsection 1002. I've got a link for that, and I'm going to go ahead and put that into the chat. And then I'll turn this over to Morgan to talk about what this means for the agency when it comes specifically to any structure that was in existence before September 1st, 1963. The director can remove, reallocate, restructure, or modify the device without cost to the owner is what they're referring to.
And I apologize, everyone. I actually don't have the full rule proposal open in front of me on my screen right now. And I was having a hard time scrambling while Gabriel's on the side. I think, Gabriel, is this the one that speaks to agricultural facilities associated with agricultural settings?
No, this is 04. This references back to RCW 7757-040 and 060. And I just kind of put a little bit there in the chat so you can see that.
Okay.
Right.
So I think this one speaks to, and I'm sorry, you guys, this feels like a test on a really important detail in front of a live audience to me, but my initial response is that I believe, again, this goes back to the differences between the Department of Fisheries and the Department of Wildlife, and this particular limitation, and I can read it out loud for folks who, like me, didn't initially have it in front of them. But what this says in RCW language, it says in RCW 7755-040 and 7755-060, a fishway or fish guard described in those two statutes and in existence on September 1st, 1963, if the director determines that those are inadequate, in addition to other authority granted in the chapter, the director may remove, relocate, reconstruct, or modify the device without cost to the owner. And then further, the director shall not materially modify the amount of flow or water through the device. After the department has completed the improvements, the fishways and fish guards shall be operated and maintained at the expense of the owner. So essentially, in plain language, what that describes is that for fishways or fish guards that are older than that date, essentially it says while the department may go onto that property to fix it, the department can't place a lien against that property, which is a remedy that would be available to us for newer structures. And I think as I read the intent of this, that this is essentially trying to provide some exemption and leniency for structures that were already at the landscape at the time that that statute was created, while still not giving up on correcting those, just indicating that the burden would be on government to correct those. Now, what I haven't done, and we're going to have to come back and provide a more thorough answer in writing. I can't recall in this moment if this is another limitation that we believe only applies to those waters where the old Department of Wildlife's authority would exist. I believe that's the case, but before we take that away as a final answer, I'd like to have us go back and do our double check and due diligence there. So I think long and the short, if I'm right about that applicability, I think what that means is that this limitation on what the government can require the landowner to do versus what the government would have to take responsibility for is limited in its scope to those places where only the old Department of Wildlife's authority would apply. Sorry, that was a little bit long, but I had to sort it out while we were talking. Hopefully that helps answer the question.
Thank you, Morgan. And thank you, Alex. And we'll likely clean these notes up a bit, especially when it comes to just pulling out words right out of a statute. Nice job, Alex. Okay, next question. I see reference to fish bearing lake streams and rivers in the standards for fishways and water diversions and elsewhere in the rule. Does this apply to potential fish habitat too, or only waters currently used by fish? The term does not appear to be defined clearly.
Maybe I can, Morgan, you want to take a break and maybe I can jump in?
Yeah, go for it, Matt.
All right, great. So I think I'm gonna try to answer this, and my team can help me if I'm not clear enough for all. So when we think about standards for fishways and water diversions elsewhere, does it apply to potential fish habitat to or only waters currently used by fish? So when we make a determination that a structure needs to be fish passable or provide fish passage, if it's currently fully blocking and fish aren't able to get upstream, but absent that human-made barrier, they would be, then yes, that they would be required to make that fish passable. That is potential fish habitat. And that does count for us requiring fish passage either through a barrier identified through 7757, or if someone's coming to us to repair or do construction work on a structure through 7755, they would still be required to make that structure fish passable if, again, absent that structure existing, fish would normally be able to get up there and use that habitat. Did I answer the question, or does it need more than that? That was pretty brief. If it was unclear, if there's something that's not didn't fully get explained there, please just put it in the chat.
Yeah, thank you. So
Um,
yes.
Oh, I'll
Oh,
just
go ahead.
add two cents to that. I know in the past, some people have had some questions for us about why we've chosen to use the expressions lakes, rivers, or streams versus waters of the state, which is fairly common in the hydraulic code. It's because specific to this RCW, it only references lakes, rivers, or streams. And so early on when we were developing the rule, we did consult with our attorneys, like, can we reference waters of the state? And they said, no, we cannot. We can only limit this to a lake, stream, or river. And as we started working through this, we realized it was only in fish-bearing waters that we'd want this to apply. And so I think Matt's answer still stands for that as well. Just a little bit of context about why we chose that terminology. It's because it's directly in the statute itself.
And I probably should have said the contrary to that. Morgan pointed out earlier that if there is a question about whether fish habitat would be beyond a human-made barrier, but it's part of a wholly artificial channel or a wholly artificial design, that would not be something we would identify as potential fish habitat, right? Our jurisdiction doesn't extend beyond that, and fish were never meant to be up in those wholly artificial channels. That's why 7757 is asking for screening of those areas where we don't want fish to be. Hopefully I didn't muddy the water.
The only thing I would add is just if any part of the question is thinking about, current use and what would have been historic use, for example, by salmon and steelhead, absolutely this statute applies to rivers and streams that would have been historically used by fish. So we're looking at the historic range of distribution, and that becomes a really important point, especially when you're talking about fish passage, where a human-made barrier has actually prevented fish from occupying and using the habitats that they would historically have been. And that's actually, we view that as being the sort of fundamental point and intent of the statute. So hopefully that helps too.
Great. Okay. All right, we have one more question here, and we do have plenty of time. So if anyone has other questions, go ahead and add those into the Q&A at the bottom there. So this question, please cite the specific statutes or other documents which provide the basis to conclude fishways are inclusive of all types of fish passage structures. Also, which statutes provide explicit authority to incorporate future projections of peak flow and BFW, which I assumed was bankful width, based on a multi-step modeling process, each of which contains uncertainty, much of it unquantified. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm going to take this one. It took me a second to find my unmute. Great questions, Darren. Yeah, I'm happy to talk about this a little bit. So I think the first place folks are really going to want to look closely at is RCW 7757030. And if you haven't, if you all haven't looked at this chapter, I know most folks don't make a habit of reading RCW, but trust me, this one is short and it's pretty direct and plain talked. So it's a good one if you want to make a foray into reading RCW. When you look at 7757030, this is the section that describes the primary requirements around providing fish passage. And the title of this subsection is Fishways Required in Dams and obstructions. So again, when we look at this, I'm going to call your attention to a couple of the legislative language pieces that, again, as you'll see, are in pretty plain terms. Under 1, what it says is subject to subsection 3 of this section, a dam or other obstruction across or in a stream shall be provided with a durable and efficient fishway approved by the director. So a couple of things I want to draw your attention to. The first part is that the main premise of this authority from the legislature is that the fishway has to be approved by the director. So that gives a lot of responsibility to the department to define what will meet the approval of the director. The second piece I want to call out is the word durable. So a dam or other obstructions across or in a stream shall be provided with a durable and efficient fishway approved by the director. Durable automatically implies that it will last over time. And we believe the implication is that it will continue to function as it was designed to pass fish. The second piece I want to call your attention to, still in that subsection 1, is the third sentence. It says, the fishway shall be maintained in an effective condition and continuously supplied with sufficient water to freely pass fish. So that sentence it adds further explanation to the reference in the first sentence about durable and efficient. So in that sentence, we see that the legislature is saying that fishway, which remember again is for any dam or other obstruction across or in a stream, it's a durable and efficient fishway. So a way for fish to pass through. And that third sentence in that first section says it shall be maintained. So again, it's emphasizing this idea of it should continue to function as it was designed over time. It shall be maintained in an effective condition and continuously supplied with sufficient water to freely pass fish. So when the second part of Darren's question was about asking for a little bit of justification about why we're bringing climate adaptation into this rulemaking. And the answer is that we have a tremendous amount of science that's been third-party peer reviewed. It's been tested by the department and a number of our partners and members of the regulated community on a voluntary basis over the last number of years. And we have a high degree of scientific confidence in the information and the models that are projecting what the future widths of streams will be. In some parts of the state in the Columbia Plateau, we know that some of those stream widths are likely to actually decrease as our water system, water supply and climate changes. In many places in the rest of the state, we know that those widths of streams and rivers are actually going to increase. And that's for different reasons. In some basins, we know that's because they've previously primarily been systems that store snow, and they're going to move to rain-dominated systems. And most of those projections show the parts of the state where that increased rainfall and the increased transition to being rain-dominated systems. That's sort of the explanation for why many of those streams are projected to change. One of the things we also know from those projections is that in some places it's very little change, and in some places it's very large change. So when we looked at all of that and our scientific confidence about what those future conditions are going to be, and we look at the direction from the legislature in this statute, that part of the the approval of the director should be considering that those be durable fishways, that they're effectively maintained and they continue to have the right amount of water to freely pass fish. We feel like it's an obligation to bring in our understanding of the data about those future conditions. And we can talk more about that as well. Darren or anybody else, we can provide a link to the department's webpage that describes in a little bit more detail the scientific tool that's helping us understand future flows. One thing I guess I will add to, Darren, we've been working pretty closely with the Department of Natural Resources because the state and the forest industry has made some pretty big investments in fish passage over the last couple of decades. And so we've been working hard to try to understand whether and if we think this language about climate will have large impacts for the forest industry. And I will share with folks here that our initial thinking, based on looking at what some of those projections are for headwater streams, indicates that they were not seeing really large projections in most cases for headwater streams. And given that DNR's regulation of fish passage structures in the forested landscape has been thinking about, durable fishways and, making sure that culverts and other passage structures pass water and fish, our initial sense is that this won't result in big changes for the forest industry. I mean, we need to look at every site, of course, but as best we can tell from trying to look at examples and look landscape wide, that's been the conclusion we've drawn so far. Hopefully that's helpful and relevant.
Okay. Oh, I see another question that just came in. All right. Does DFW have specific standards for fully considered, so that's quote unquote, fully considered, regarding future Q100 and future bank full widths? Question mark. Local experience indicates that shall consider, quote unquote, does not amount to much and is very different from, quote, shall incorporate into design. If the issue is considered, but the proponent chooses to go a different way, that has passed standard under SMA ecology. This sounds like a voluntary inclusion of climate adapted design in fishways. Is DFW supporting a voluntary standard for climate adapted culverts or willing to clarify these would be requirements for culvert replacements?
I can take a first crack at this one and then see if anyone else on the team wants to add. This is not a voluntary standard.
Mhm.
It is a requirement. And I think what the language says is that the projections from WDFW's tool or another approved tool shall be considered. And what we expect that will do in practical terms is that it will require the applicant to provide some of their rationale and justification for how they have thought about those projections in light of their design. But to one of the things that I think that was Nora's question that she's asking is, we don't yet have specific standards. And so one of the reasons that we chose to go with that regulatory approach where we're requiring consideration and sort of showing the math of how that's been considered in design, and we retain the ultimate decision under fish passage to decide whether that is sufficient or not. But one of the reasons why we went with it shall be considered, but we did not reduce it to a more specific standard, is because we felt like that language better matches where we're at in our learning and evolution to bringing consideration of these changing bank full widths into the design of culverts. This is one of the challenges we've also identified for ourselves, as well as folks who are regulated by this statute, that we need to do much more work, and we are already and continuing this, but we need to continue to press to give more specific guidance about what adequate consideration in design looks like. And I think some examples of what we will expect will be that, as I was saying in answer to Darren's question earlier, we know that the magnitude of the change in different parts, it can be wildly different in different sites in different parts of the state. And so we want to dig deeper into what does that consideration in the design look like when the change that's projected is not very different from the current condition. Similarly, in places where I think the biggest impact will be in places where the change that's projected is very, very large. And what does that need to mean in terms of the design, given the site particulars, and given what the level of risk is in terms of fish that are there or would use the structure. So that last part is a long-winded way of agreeing that this is actually one big part of the challenge. And we didn't feel like we had the information yet to be really precise and black and white about what these projections should mean to different designs and sites. I expect that that's going to come up a lot, frankly, in implementation. And so one of the challenges and responsibilities the department will have is having chains of command and supervision maybe more engaged in this particular topic than they have to be in other sort of more business as usual. And that we'll be using those conversations and sort of greater engagement by supervision and management to help inform the kind of guidance that we need to create to make it a little bit more easier and more routine as time goes on. I don't know if anyone else on the team would like to add to that or add to any of the circumstances we found so far on a voluntary basis incorporating this into project design.
Okay.
I would only add, Morgan, that your point about not being a voluntary standard should be like reinforced too, right? We certainly don't see that way, and the explanation of the rationale should they choose not to incorporate it will be the part that we'll be looking for to either defend a decision one way or the other on permitting the project. So that's that. I think that's needs to be said a second time. Anyway, thank you.
Okay. I'm not seeing other questions in the queue. We do have plenty of time. So if there's any other questions, please do add them in. We can move to you, Gabrielle, and see if there's any other questions. And if you'd like to talk about next steps for a minute, we can add some resources into the chat. And then Morgan will give some final remarks and thank yous. So Gabrielle, go ahead.
Great. If you wouldn't mind, there we go, giving me some control back so I can share my screen. So next steps, as I mentioned, we are in process of having some adjustments made to the Fish and Wildlife Commission's hearing schedule right now. So there's a possibility that this will have its hearing at the end of October. If not in October, it'll definitely be in mid-December at their mid-November at their November 17th meeting as well. And as I mentioned earlier, we will be following up with emails for everyone who's responded and provided feedback thus far, as well as posting it with a news release also to our website and our social media as well, just to make sure we're letting as many people know about the potential changes as well and what that will look like on the ground. In the meantime, I'm going to quickly share my screen while those of you maybe think of additional questions that you might have while you've got a captive audience here today. But it's different ways that you can comment specifically to this rule. There's a lot of different ways that you can reach out to us to share your thoughts about the proposal itself. And so if you can see here on your screen, that the comments are going to basically be due the day following the Fish and Wildlife Committee's public hearing, whether that's in October or November. And you can comment either online on our public input website. There's a comment box that you can do there. And that's both for the SEPA process, which we have done, in addition to the draft language itself as well. Or you're welcome to email us directly at fishpassage101@publicinput.com. We also don't want to limit the ways that people can respond to us via electronically as well. So if people are so inclined, they may write a letter to us and mail it to me, bringing it specifically to address to me, Gabrielle Stillwater. Or you can fax that in to us, making sure that you draw attention, adding my name to that. Or you can leave us a voice message as well. And the phone number for that, and I'll say this out loud for people who can't see the screen, it's 855-925-2801. And when prompted, the project code for this is 4535. And additionally, we will be updating our project website for DFW's main public facing page with the draft language. And we should have the small business economic impact statement there directly. And we'll be uploading the cost benefit analysis for that as well as the SEPA determination. So you all have access to see the documents that we've created in line with our government regulations. So I'll leave this up just for a little bit in case anybody's hastily scratching that down, any of the methods that we have.
Great, and you can take a screenshot of that with your phone. Okay, well, I'm not seeing any other questions here, so I think we can go ahead and move to Morgan for final remarks.
Thanks, Joy. Again, I just want to thank everybody for your time. We know this rulemaking has been long and detailed with a number of different versions in the CR 101 stage as we put ideas on paper and solicited feedback and then changed based on what we've heard. So I also really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you today and kind of walk you through where we landed in our final rule proposal. I also appreciate the questions because I think a number of those questions are things others are likely to want to know about and wonder about. And so having the opportunity to answer them and capture that, thank you, Alex, in a record that we can share with other people is really helpful. I also think a number of the questions showcase places and emphasize places we had already been thinking about as challenges we need to turn our attention to in implementing this rule language. And so that's really helpful as well. So again, just thank you. Please don't see this as the only opportunity to offer comments. That's why we wanted to make sure you have all the links for the different methodologies for asking more questions or providing comment. And again, please do that. We take that really seriously and we look at that closely when we have conversations with our commission. Please also do pay attention, as Gabriel said, we're trying to sort through our understanding of where our commission's agendas for October, November, and December are landing, and we'll make sure to communicate clearly about any changes and finalizing where the public hearing will be, and that'll be another really important opportunity if you'd like to add or reiterate concerns or questions. So thank you again for your time.
Great. Okay. One quick question. When will the CBA be available?
So right now we are waiting for the finalized version of that to come from Industrial Economics. They have done a great job of meeting our questions and edits along the way. And so we provided them our final edits on Friday and should expect that back by the end of the week, hopefully. I've been in communication with our project managers on that, and I will make sure to follow up as soon as it's available and also post that on the website. And I will definitely email that to you, Darren.
Excellent. Okay, got that final question in. With that, I think we're good to go. Thank you, Morgan. Thank you, DFW team. And we have some resources in the chat for you. Thanks so much. Enjoy the rest of your day. We'll let you go. Bye now.
Thank you, everyone.